This episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast is presented by American Underdog. It's the new Kurt Warner movie that's coming out Christmas Day. Have you seen the trailer for it yet? It's phenomenal. Zachary Levi is playing Kurt Warner. You remember him from Shazam? He's playing Kurt Warner, and I got to see a preview of this movie. It is fantastic, and it's more of a romantic movie, family type movie than it is a football movie, although there's a lot of football in there. And it really depicts Kurt Warner's relationship and sort of growth and this unreal journey to the NFL, along with the relationship that he made with his wife, Brenda, and built with her. And I love the movie. Again, it releases Christmas Day by Lionsgate. It is phenomenal. It's directed by the Irwin brothers, Andy and John Irwin. You talk about faith, you talk about football, you talk about family. This is the movie to go see Christmas Day and the Christmas week that everybody's off after for the most part. American Underdog, the Kurt Warner film. Go see it.
This is Sports Spectrum, the intersection of sports and faith, where we bring Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
And welcome everyone to Sports Spectrum. I am Jason Romano. So glad that you're tuning into the show today. Make sure you check out our website, sportspectrum.com. So much content there. It's a wonderful place to go if you're looking for stories, articles, podcasts, devotionals, all free and all right there at the website on the intersection of sports and faith at sportspectrum.com. And when you're there, click that subscribe button at the top of the website and sign up for Sports Spectrum Weekly. It's our weekly email that comes to you each week, keeps you posted, keeps you up to date on everything that's happening in Sports Spectrum. We don't spam you. We don't inundate you with emails. Just one a week telling you what you may have missed from the world of Sports Spectrum. And if you sign up now, we have a free 10-day devotional for you that we will send to you if you sign up right now for Sports Spectrum Weekly. That's our newsletter, and it's over at sportspectrum.com. All right, today on the show, this is quite the interview for me because I get to talk to my boss, Steve Stenstrom. He is the president of Sports Spectrum. He's also the president of Pro Athletes Outreach and a former NFL quarterback. Played 5 seasons in the NFL with the Chiefs, Bears, and 49ers. He was also drafted by the Chiefs in 1995 after a very good career at Stanford, where he played quarterback under Bill Walsh, Hall of Famer, and Denny Green, longtime NFL coach and obviously college coach as well during his time at Stanford. And Steve was there from 91 to 94 and still holds numerous passing records, including passing yards and completions. And now, post-career, he's about to turn 50 years old. Tomorrow, actually, is his 50th birthday. And this is long overdue. You'll hear me say it in the beginning. This should have happened probably a lot earlier. But we're 5 years into this at Sports Spectrum, and Steve being a huge influence on me and having, in many ways, been an integral part in the reason why I left ESPN to even go to Sports Spectrum was because of Steve Stenstrom. So I'm glad that we finally get to sit down and here, one day shy of his 50th birthday, we get to talk to Steve about all that God has done and is doing in his life right now. He has a heart for the gospel, and it's wonderful for me to bring to you this conversation with Steve Stenstrom, one of the best people I know right now on Sports Spectrum. Hi, Steve. Welcome to Sports Spectrum, finally.
Hey, Jason. Great to be on. Love what's going on with Sports Spectrum. So glad to be on with you.
Absolutely. And I was telling people, including our staff, this is probably should have been our first episode, but now that I think about it, almost 1,000 episodes later. So I'll just start by publicly asking for forgiveness for not having you on the show until now, right?
Totally understood. And I'm grateful by the time we get to me, all the wrinkles have been ironed out.
That's right. We're 5 years almost into this, and it's been an amazing journey, and it's great to finally have you back on. I know a lot about you, but there's a lot I don't know about you. So I'm kind of excited just to ask you some questions that I don't think I've ever really asked you in all of our working together the last 4 years. Let's start with tomorrow. Tomorrow is your 50th birthday. I'm a couple years from it, so I'm kind of living hiding behind, you a little bit here, but tomorrow's a big day for you. How are you feeling about turning 50?
It's true. It's exciting when you get to these milestones because the fact that you got to them is in some ways a good thing. But it is an indicator that, life goes on, and the chronology of life is happening and unfolding. And if you go like red on seasons of change and on shifts from one season to the next, that's not a good thing. I'm grateful I'm in a season of life where I'm excited about the coming season. And ironically, in the same year, we went to empty nest phase as parents. And so it's a lot of change in our world happening, but I'm really excited about it.
I have to imagine that's an interesting dynamic, right? Like a big number, 50, empty nester. You have 4 kids, 4 amazing kids, a couple that are married and a couple that are in college, actually 3 of them that are in college, 1 graduated. It's such an interesting, because I'm in a different phase, right? I'm getting ready to send my daughter to college. And when I turn 50, she'll be similar to your youngest daughter as being in school. It's just an interesting time of reflection. It has to be, right?
It is. It is. You realize that, in Psalm 90, Moses says, Lord, teach us to number our days aright that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Mm-hmm. How do I wake up every single day and just say, Lord, today, help me to live well and help me to live wise? And so when you get to these benchmarks, it forces some reflection back down the course of life a little bit to say, how did I do? Where are we at? And then you recalibrate and adjust and you try to go forward. But yes, big ones like this are worthy of some serious pause and reflection.
Well, the great thing about a show like this and a conversation like this is reflection is something we're going to do a lot of in telling your story and kind of looking back. So let's go back to maybe 30 years ago, 20-year-old Steve. As we're here now, turning 50, it's always good to reflect. That 20-year-old who was starting, I believe, as a freshman. I don't know if you were 20 at that point, but you were at Stanford. And who was that Steve, I guess, maybe be the best question to ask. Who was the Steve 30 years ago when you were 20 years old?
That's a good question. It's fun to go back and ponder that. You're right. I was playing for Dennis Green at Stanford University. Little did I know the next year, Bill Walsh would come in and be the head coach. And so I got to play for some incredible coaches in college. I mean, tremendous men. But I was young and ambitious and needed to grow up a lot at that time for sure. I had met the Lord as a freshman, it's right about just before my 19th year. So close to that time frame, early in my walk with Christ at that stage of my life. And there was a lot of sanctification happening in my world at that point in time. But yeah, I was climbing the ladders. I was chasing hard as a Stanford student athlete, both academically and athletically, not knowing where things were going, but recognizing the important season of college that I was in. Had no ability at that point to think that I would be drafted a few years later. But was working hard as a public policy major in college and playing on that football team with a bunch of guys that I still stay in touch with to this day.
So a lot of athletes we talk to, and you've heard a lot of these interviews, talk about identity and identity being a big issue for them. Was that a thing for you? Like, was football your God for many years as you were coming through high school and coming to Stanford?
Absolutely. I mean, I think culture then was this way. Culture today is even more this way. Performance-based living is it's all encompassing. It's all around us. And it's really what drives us in many ways. And sadly begins to replace anything else as our form of identity. We identify in the outcomes. We identify in our doing. And that was me at that time. I was driving hard. I always wanted to work hard and be my best. I didn't know if I could be the best, but I want to be my best. And that began to have benchmarks. And I think that's one of the addictive things about performance-based living is that in a weird way, we like it because there's measurable outcomes that we always know how we're doing. Inevitably, that causes a tension within our soul and within our heart that challenges us and shakes us to the core. And eventually we have to realize, is our identity supposed to be here? But it feels good conceptually to think there's a variables and inputs. If I hit the equal sign, out the other end is going to come something I'm going to be satisfied with. And that's the seductive nature of performance-based living.
That's such a great way to say it, performance-based living too. Once you become a Christian, and I want to hear that story in a second, Well, let's actually say that story. Let's tell that story. And then I'd love to hear kind of what changed for you over the next 3 years at Stanford. But you said you were a freshman, so maybe share that story.
Yeah, I was a freshman. It's actually fun. I just recently got a chance to share with my parents this version of the story because they raised us going to church, my brother and I, and so church was kind of always part of our upbringing. But I wasn't a Christian. I hadn't made a declaration to follow Jesus until I was a freshman in college, and so I'm grateful for the background I had that made me receptive to invitations to Bible studies or church or other groups. But it was that freshman year. I remember sitting at a table outside of the student union at Stanford University. I sat down with the director of Athletes in Action on campus, and he just opened up kind of what the scriptures declare about us as people, that God has a great plan for our lives, that our sin separates us from God, that Jesus came as an atoning sacrifice for us, and that by receiving that free gift of salvation, I could be in right standing with God. And I made the simple but very clear decision that day that I wanted that kind of a life. I wanted a life that had Jesus at the center, and more than that, I wanted Jesus leading the way and taking me in the direction he wanted me to go. And that's a critical step from an identity standpoint. I didn't know it then. Right. I didn't know that prior to that, I had no capacity to combat that performance-based living with what I call grace-based living. But that's what shifted that day. I became a new creation in Christ. And suddenly, by God imparting an indwelling presence of his Holy Spirit in my life, I'm now equipped with a new resource, a new tool to push back on that performance-based living with the grace-based life that God gives us and promises us in Christ.
When you said yes at that time and started your journey with the Lord, was there any skepticism? Was there any, investigation, if you will? Because it's one thing to say yes, and then it's another thing to live it out. But I'm just thinking of somebody like yourself, who's super smart, one of the smartest people I know. I have to imagine then you were, smart as well, going to Stanford, right? And so there's this intellectual side, and a lot of people will argue, well, that's not real. It's not tangible. It's not right here. Did you go through a wrestle with that at all?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was prior to that day, but what I heard that day and responded to that day did not create a cognitive dissonance, to use a fancy term, right? There was nothing that disagreed with my intellectual pursuits up to that point in time. I am by nature a little skeptical. I'm slow to just jump. But when I jump, I'm convinced of it. I'm all in. And so in that moment, God had prepared my heart and my mind to receive what was being shared. And up to that stage, I had my questions answered and realized, look, we're all living by faith in something. Everybody is living by faith in something. Yeah. And the ultimate question of life is there a God? Who is he? And who am I in relationship to him? And so that day I recognized that without a life following Jesus, I was not properly aligned with his intentions nor my design, and it was time to get on board.
So the question I initially was going to ask, what changed? What was that like, beginning this new journey with Christ, but also having this pretty important role as quarterback at Stanford the next couple of years? And I know Bill Walsh came in, as you said, and we'll talk about Coach Walsh in a second, but what changed for you as you went about your role as a quarterback, but also your role as a student, as just a person? What changed?
Yeah, that's great. I tell people all the time, my faith journey and my football journey are not all that different, in that I'm a product of great coaching. I football from high school all the way through the NFL, product of great coaches all the way along the way. When I accepted Christ as a freshman at Stanford, I began meeting with 3 to 4 men for an hour a week, every week for the whole time I was there. Wow. And they became, in essence, coaches for me, life coaches, spiritual mentors, to just say, Steve, this is what it looks like to follow Jesus. This is what a follower of Christ looks like in the world. And this is how you study his word and begin to apply it in our everyday circumstances. And that's what changed, Jason. It was just the beginning of what Eugene Peterson entitles his book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. I just began one day at a time, stepping in a direction. I didn't know that's what was happening. I'm looking 30 years back now, right, going, that's what was going on. And I stumbled and fell. I veered off the course. I did things that you would say aren't in alignment with what the Word of God says. Of course I did. That's what he means to be human. And so I'm excited to look back and go, yeah, and encourage younger people who are in their 20s. It's okay to feel like you've got a long ways to go. I think the longer I go, the longer I feel like I have to go still.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm excited about the journey because it's a long obedience in the same direction, day in, day out, one step at a time.
Steve Stenstrom is joining us here on Sports Spectrum, a former quarterback at Stanford, an NFL quarterback as well. He's the president of Sports Spectrum and of Pro Athletes Outreach. I got to ask about playing for Bill Walsh. Like, you're talking about one of the all-time greats. I'm talking about a guy I rooted against for many years as a Cowboys fan in the 80s, watching him win Super Bowls and crush the 8-year-old Jason when Dwight Clark caught that pass from Joe Montana. I have to imagine it was such a cool experience for you playing for 3 seasons under Bill Walsh. What was that like?
It was amazing. I will say first, though, I grew up as a Cowboys fan too, growing up in Dallas. So I was equally heartbroken. So that didn't, by that the time Coach Walsh showed up at Stanford, just before spring ball of my second year, but then I played 3 seasons for him. In fact, the last 3 seasons he would ever coach, had a chance to play for him. By that time, Joe Montana had become a role model, in the football realm. I mean, 6'2", 195 pounds at the time. I've got a few more pounds today than I did back then, but he was the guy I wanted to emulate. And so when the coach of the Niners showed up at Stanford to coach, it was a dream come true. And I tell people all the time, I just tried to be around him. I just wanted to be close to him. I wanted to pick, if he was going to say something to somebody else, I wanted to hear what he had to say, because most likely it would be something that could inform the way I could play the game too. He was a consummate teacher, a great, great instructor, so that, again, the classic formula for being changed is the right information with the right application times multiple repetitions of it. That leads to the change. So he was not only give the right information, he was really good at helping you know how to apply it in your unique circumstance.
Yeah, he wrote that book on leadership before he passed. The Score Takes Care of Itself. I'd really like to dive just for a little bit into that leadership style that you saw that maybe has helped you. Maybe there's a lesson or 2 or 3 that to this day, you're one of my favorite leaders and one of the great leaders I know, Steve, obviously. So I'm wondering maybe one or 2 things that you take away from your time with Coach Walsh that maybe you still practice today.
It's great. If the first thing that came to mind, because like you said, he wrote books on this stuff. There was an endless amount of things that I could point to. But the first thing that popped in my mind, Jason, which I think it's very much in alignment with a life of faith and trying to lead well, is it didn't matter who it was. Coach Walsh cared about that. If that person was connected to the team and was involved in the process, in the building, so to speak, or they were on the field, they were important. And that person knew they were important because of the way he treated them. It wasn't artificial. It wasn't manufactured. He genuinely loved the game of football and at such a deep level that just whoever was around at the time, you just felt important to him. And he invested. He didn't always have time, right? You're the head guy. You got to keep moving. But he did take time with people. He invested in people on all, whether you were Joe Montana as his quarterback or you were somebody that just worked in the building who most people may not know their name. Coach took time with those people.
Was he also influential? I have to imagine he was, in helping prepare you for the NFL too, right? Like to get ready for the draft, and just having a coach who's a pro football Hall of Famer. He's known more for certainly his NFL career than he is for his college coaching. But I have to imagine as you're sitting there getting ready to finish out your collegiate career and you don't know if you're going to get drafted or not. I mean, nobody really truly ever knows if you're when you're going, but having a Bill Walsh around, I have to imagine that helps you prepare.
Absolutely. There's no question I felt ready. And I felt prepared to the best of my ability. And a large part of that was Coach doing that. In fact, it was sad when he passed away and I didn't get a chance to finish this process, but I had started a process of still sitting down with him years later to reflect backwards together on our experiences as coach and quarterback, because to me, the West Coast offense and everything that it encompassed and entailed, there were a lot of parallels to what I've experienced in a life of faith. And I wanted to explore those intersections with him and see if there wasn't something in that I would eventually write someday or put down on paper someday. We only got a few conversations into that before things took a tragic turn and we had to say goodbye.
Hey guys, let's take a quick break. I want to tell you about this film that I mentioned at the top of the conversation, American Underdog. As we talk here with Steve Stenstrom, right? We're talking about faith and football with Steve. Well, this movie is faith and football and really family as well. And it's a story of Kurt Warner. I mean, if you don't know who Kurt Warner is, all you got to do is look him up. But if you're an NFL fan, I mean, he's a Pro Football Hall of Famer now. But 25 years ago, he was a guy who was undrafted in college out of Northern Iowa and had no idea that he would ever go on the journey that he went on. This movie, American Underdog, actually depicts that journey, and it does it beautifully. It shows how Kurt Warner and his wife Brenda got together and really walked through Kurt's early years in the NFL. Zachary Levi, the actor who played in Shazam, he's playing Kurt Warner, and I got to tell you, I got to see a screening. It's really good. I mean, he's very spot on. I mean, you can tell that he worked at being Kurt Warner, the throwing style, the look, even the sort of 12 o'clock shadow on the beard. I mean, it was really, really a well-done performance. And if you're looking for a faith film, a family film, a football film, and it's Christmas time, we can go see the movies again. This is a movie to go see in the theaters. Take your family, take your friends, and go see American Underdog, releasing Christmas Day. Steve Stenstrom is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. Take me to 1995 and the NFL draft. And by this time, you're getting ready and prepared to live out this dream of going to the NFL. But behind the scenes, there's some things that you're going through that would prove much more important, obviously, but very difficult at the same time for a young person to go through in regards to your brother. Can you share that story for us?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. In 1995, April 1995 should have been the culmination in many ways of what the last 10 years of my career, my football life had been up to that point, the moment of getting drafted. And the irony of it is I was sitting next to my brother's bedside in a hospital room in Ithaca, New York, as he was in a coma from spinal meningitis. And it was just the two of us in our family. Jeff was my best friend in many ways. We were 4 years apart, so we didn't do that competitive brother thing as much because we weren't close enough to do it. So we were really each other's biggest fans, cheerleaders, encouragers. And I didn't know what was going on, but I knew we flew from San Diego to Ithaca, New York really quickly leading up to the draft weekend, and just sat there hoping and praying that somehow this would change course in that hospital. And it didn't. We ended up having to make the really hard decision to take Jeff off of life support. And so in the middle of all of that, I didn't forget it was draft weekend, but we weren't paying attention to the draft. In fact, I remember actually hearing that I got drafted from somebody else at that point in time. And we turned on ESPN at that stage and the ticker was going across the bottom. And I did see pick 134 Chiefs. I mean, those things, but it wasn't until after it happened. And to be honest, it was right. I mean, it's in its proper context, something that I had many ways made an idol in my life, poured my life into, chased hard after. I'm not sorry I did it, but it put it in its proper perspective for me in that moment. And I just resolved, and my wife, Lori, and we resolved together, like, after that day, after that weekend, let's chase this thing as hard as we can, as long as we can, but let's never forget the ultimate issues in life and the ultimate matters in life. And let's invest our lives in that, regardless of what job we do, and wherever life takes us. This moment here should remind us that that ultimately life does come to an end for all of us. For Jeff, in our minds, it came way too early, but it did. And thankfully he knew Jesus too, and had made a decision to follow him. And I so have great confidence as I'm now 50, what is that? 26 years later from that day, marching closer to the day when one day I'll stand there too. And it's the end of my journey.
Yeah.
And I have the confidence that we'll be reunited in that moment.
So he had spinal meningitis, you said? Is that,
Yep.
that's a sudden thing, right? Like or is that something that I'm not a medical guy. That's not something that he suffered with. It just kind of came on suddenly, right?
It comes on suddenly. There's certainly periods where it really takes its toll on your body, and you got to get to the hospital fast. And so he was just sick it seemed like a cold. And that led to, to an emergency room visit. And, quite honestly, not that different than some of the stories we're hearing about COVID right now, Jason, where just a cold leads to something much more severe very quickly. And sadly, a lot of families have experienced what we went through as a family in that moment, in this most recent season of life that we're all living through.
Tell me about the immediate aftermath of that. I mean, that's a lot to go through. You're 23 at the time. You're getting selected into the NFL, and you lose your brother, and just your faith is still a few years old. So thankfully you have that foundation, but you're still young in your faith too. You're just young in general, right? It sounds like you have been married by that time to Lori. So you're a young husband as well. All of that. How are you able to process all of that and kind of walk through that? I mean, did football help provide an escape to just encase yourself into the NFL game? Because losing a brother, that's a big deal, obviously.
It's a massive deal. And I think, I have great empathy and compassion and I have ever since then, for families or people who go through something as sudden and tragic and earth shattering as that. Mm-hmm. I would say it's true in a way. I threw myself into football in a fresh way to kind of, wasn't an escape. I don't think it was, my relationship with Jeff remained a good motivator for me to embrace every day now, and with a vigor and a passion for it. But at the end of the day, Jason, that foundation in Christ that I had arrived at about 5 years earlier, my freshman year at Stanford that we already talked about, that was the foundation that I clung to, stood on, rested in, and said, if we're going to get through this, it's only because of the grace of God and the foundation we have in Christ. And so I just dove into the scriptures all the more. I spent time with those who were fellow Christ followers, men and women, that we could just be encouraged by them, allowed them to just encourage me in a way that I needed to be encouraged. And I experienced the body of Christ in a fresh way, both on that team, which we had a great fellowship on that team, and beyond that team.
Steve Stenstrom is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. You come to the NFL, you get drafted by KC, but you end up really with the Bears, right? Like, that's the team that you spent the majority of your career with, 4 seasons in Chicago. As a follower of Christ, a young believer, having gone through that, what was it like acclimating yourself to the pro game? Was that a hard adjustment for you, or was that kind of seamless in the sense that you were able to have things in its proper place? Well,
I'm grateful that I had my faith journey underway by that stage, because that performance-based living that we talked about, we got multiplied exponentially in that environment. Yeah. I can still see the practice field where it dawned on me for the first time, because I looked around as we're just throwing routes to receivers in Chicago with nobody covering the receivers, just routes on air. And, there's three of us throwing balls, and look over and there's guys with charts, and they're just kind of marking the charts. And you realize, okay, those people work for the team, and they're part of the scouting department that every team, there's an entire part of this building that's dedicated to figuring out if I'm the right guy to do my job at all times. And when do we need an upgrade? Yeah. Right. So all times you're being evaluated based upon your performance. I mean, I wondered if they sometimes watched the way you ran to the water station or something like that. Just like how far does this go? But nevertheless, it just absolutely is. It's an exhilarating environment as a pro, because I still love the pro game. The college game inspires me. The pro game, I love seeing things at the elite level. I mean, when you see it done by the best of the best, anything in life, that's where I like to be. It was incredible to be in that environment. I got to play with some incredible, people, some of the greatest of all time. I got to play against some of the greatest of all time. And that was a lot of fun, but it was a wake up call in the sense that you better bring your A game every moment of every day. Don't get sleepy in the meeting rooms. You just don't leave the building early. I had a coach, my very first day in Chicago, Ron Turner was the offensive coordinator, and he had coached me at Stanford under Dennis Green. I studied film late that night, getting ready for the Tampa Bay game that weekend. And I was leaving the meeting room. Eric Kramer was the only guy left in the room. He was a starter. He's going to watch another, game film on an opponent. It was time for me to go home and get some sleep. I was walking out of the building, and Ron Turner looked at me and he goes, "Hey," he caught me coming out the stairs or something. He said, "Hey, how was your day?" I said, "It was fine. Good to be here. Thanks, coach." Because I had just shown up in Chicago. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm heading home." And he said, "Do you watch film?" I said, "Yeah, I watch a lot of film." He goes, "Steve, just keep in mind one thing before you go. And it's good for you to know in this league. The first guy out the door is usually the first guy out the door." And so I turned around and I walked myself right back into that film room and kept going. I wasn't the first guy out the door that day. In fact, I was like the second to last guy out the door. Yeah. But I understood his point. And so I'm grateful that I had that experience. But again, if I hadn't been growing as a follower of Christ and having some of that grace-based identity, pushing back against performance-based identity, I don't know what would have happened.
I bet you were never first out the door going forward ever again, right? In your career.
Yeah, no, that's right. I was like, I got to figure out the way to make sure everybody else has gone before me.
Yeah, exactly. Somehow, some way, I'm not going to be the first out the door. Yeah. Was it a good time in Chicago? I mean, I have to imagine such a cool city to play in. And I mean, it's 96 when you got there, right? Or 95. So you're talking 95. About Michael Jordan and the Bulls and the whole, the three-peat, the second three-peat there that we just watched on the ESPN documentary last year. It had to be a pretty cool time to be in Chicago.
Oh, unbelievable time to be in, but it was definitely by that point. The Bulls were the show, but it was still a Bears town. That's the funny thing about Chicago. They love their Bears. Yeah. And despite the fact they were rough years from a football standpoint, if you were a Bears fan,
yeah.
And they were great years if you were a Bulls fan, they still loved their Bears. And I just, it was an incredible time. Great sports town. The Cubs, the White Sox, all of them, they're just phenomenal. Blackhawks. It was just such a fun time to be there. But just if you're walking around and all of a sudden Walter Payton walks in the building and there's sweetness right there. Like, this is just the guy I enjoyed watching, and he was full of life every time he came around. But definitely a highlight for me was getting a chance to meet Michael Jordan and get to know him while we were both athletes in the same city, albeit he was on a whole different trajectory athletically at that point. I also enjoyed eating in his restaurant as often as I could.
I would imagine. Tell me that story. How did you meet Michael Jordan? I mean, I guess just playing in Chicago, that's going to happen naturally at some places. But what was your story when you met him?
Yeah, actually, it was after a Bulls game one time. We were, they wanted to do, I was invited to do a halftime 3-point contest out on the court.
Okay. Do you have any basketball skills, Steve? Are you a basketball?
I was a decent shooter.
Okay.
But I specialized in being, pretty good on defense. So, I was a good 6th or 7th guy. I wish I could be one of these other guys that plays multiple sports and was incredible at them. I was fine. I was good. So
okay. Yeah.
I was very happy to say yes to a 3-point contest because I thought, okay, that's in my wheelhouse. I can shoot. So we got there before the game, warmed up, was shooting really well. Like the whole thing, this, I'm ready for this. Well, what changed was, those hoops are out in the middle of a giant stadium. And then all of a sudden when the fans filled in for the game, depth perception was a lot different. at that point in time. So when we got up there, I think I airballed my first two shots, and then the next third shot, it was just like, I got to hit something. But no, that was the day I met Michael Jordan, was after the game. We just had a chance to be down in the locker room and around the locker room. And so, it was just a phenomenal team, phenomenal moment. And he was gracious to take some time and say hi.
That's awesome. And then you go to San Francisco. You were only there a year, but I thought it would make sense. You go from one GOAT to another, right? With Michael Jordan, and then you go and you get to throw passes to Jerry Rice. Terrell Owens is also there. Steve Young's also there. Just even though it was 1 year, I have to imagine that experience of being around those Hall of Famers must have been pretty cool. What was that like for you?
It was a great experience to meet them and get to, spend time with them. I had, really admired Steve Young and his game. And, unfortunately, that was the year that he got those concussions. And so our year really became defined by, is Steve going to ever play again?
Right.
That was kind of the year. So Jeff Garcia and I went back and forth as the quarterback for that season. And it was incredible to have Terrell Owens on one side and Jerry Rice on the other side. I mean, you had some serious weapons out there, and it's just a treat to play for those teams. At the same time, you got a huddle where everybody expects to get the ball. So now you're in the huddle calling plays, and everybody's like, "Hey, throw it to me this time. Throw it to me this." It's just. I think that's probably why a lot of teams in college don't huddle up anymore, is they just stay at the line of scrimmage and then keep that little small talk out of the huddle and whatnot. But I loved that experience. It was fun to play for Coach Mariucci, and Greg Knapp was actually my quarterback coach at that time. And it was really sad this year to have his life tragically end. Marty Morningwig was on that staff. It was an incredible group of players and coaches for an incredible organization, and to see the long-standing history of, and you appreciate why the 49ers are among the teams that have withstood the test of time and come back and built teams and whatnot. It permeates the whole building.
And kind of full circle a little bit with the Bill Walsh connection, right? Coming to San Francisco.
Yeah, you're right. And, it was being in the Bay Area and having watched those teams, and Bill was actually in the building that year still. He was, I think he was the GM at that point. He was working with the team still. And so there were several of us Stanford guys that found our way to the 49ers that year.
Let's talk about, I guess it would be now more like 20 years ago instead of 30 years ago, when your NFL career kind of comes to an end. You're 30 years old from my math that I was doing. And suddenly you have this transition into no longer playing football, and you're in ministry now. Was ministry on your mind when you retired? Did you know at that point that, you know what, I think God is clearly calling me into this area?
I think it's interesting to look back on that and now trying to piece together what were the moving parts that led to a decision. The things I mentioned about my brother and my football career after that, there was a resolve and a commitment that had taken over in our life, my wife and I, that we're going to invest our lives whenever possible in ultimate matters. And that ultimate matters meant our own walk with Jesus and helping other people discover who Jesus is and begin a walk with him too. So that resolve was there. We never envisioned it being vocational ministry. Like we were back in the Bay Area because of that time with the 49ers. We were living there. We had a home there. We kept going over to campus. Lori was a All-American swimmer, world-class student athlete at Stanford too. And so we met, both felt like we could walk back through the hallways and on the sidewalks where, current athletes are walking that we had walked on, and maybe we could serve them in a volunteer capacity, but didn't see it being a vocation.
Right.
So this was, 2001. We're talking about 2002. I'm talking to people. Okay, what do I do next, and where do we spend time next? And what caught us off guard the most, because I thought I jumped in with one of the Silicon Valley startups that was happening at that time, and you work inside of the Stanford network there and have this trajectory as kind of a tech guy or something. And we were asked to host a summer Bible study at our home. And we were having student athletes over at our house once a week for dinner and Bible study. And it was 15 of them at a time. And the Athletes in Action couple had asked us if we would host because they were leaving for the summer. And we said, we'd love to do that. It's right in our wheelhouse. Great way to volunteer once again. And we were also doing a Bible study called Experiencing God at that moment. And it's by Henry Blackaby. And it's a great workbook to work through. It's just a great way to know and experience the will of God, I think is the subtitle. And there was a place in there where it said, look to see where God's at work and join him there. And Lori and I, that really connected one morning for Lori and I. And we had just been observing how easy it was to have these kids in our home, to spend time with them, to relate to them, and just speak truth into their life. And we looked up from across the books over a cup of coffee that morning, and we kind of both knew at that moment that we were actually supposed to jump in full time. Everything we have, no holding back, full time in a ministry capacity, back at the Stanford campus working with student athletes. That's all we knew, but we said yes to that. And our resolve was, when we knew what the obedient thing to do was, we're going to do the obedient thing.
I love that. The obedient thing to do, so that you did the obedient thing. God calls you to be obedient in all decisions. And then another decision comes to you and Lori. I don't know, was it 10 years ago now with PAO? Maybe a little more. And this ministry, Pro Athletes Outreach. And for those listening, they probably heard it if they're faithful listeners to the show, because a lot of athletes, particularly baseball and football players, will kind of mention PAO, or I was at the PAO conference. You're the president of PAO, Pro Athletes Outreach. Tell us about that outreach and kind of what drew you to it and the opportunity to, because I know you were a part of it before you ever became the president. Right. You and Lori would attend these conferences that PAO is about. Tell us about that moment when suddenly, becoming the president, that's a lot different than just attending a conference.
Yeah, it is. It also makes you realize you're getting older. We met the ministry for the first time when we were playing in Chicago our rookie year, and went to our very first conference. The chaplain of the team in Chicago invited us to go, and we went. And in fact, it was interesting because it always happened around our anniversary, February 18th. So almost always in that time frame. So we were celebrating our anniversary almost every year at this conference. That was our very first anniversary. We went to the first conference in February of 96, and we just stayed plugged in. And then we stayed connected to the ministry after we were done playing too, because now we were doing campus ministry at Stanford with student athletes. Some of those guys that were on the football team that were part of the ministry, although we worked with all sports, if they were in football or baseball, we were like, you should go to this conference that happens that really was important in our lives. We're going to be there. Why don't you come meet us there? And so we kept doing that for years. We served on the board of directors of the ministry for many years. And then after about 8.5, 9 years of campus ministry, I had actually just started talking to Lori about how long are we going to do this campus ministry thing? Kind of feel like I'm maybe getting a little bit less relevant to these young student athletes. I'm 38 years old now. Yeah. But I've got a weird resume. I played in the NFL for 6 years, and now I've been doing ministry for 8 years. What am I qualified to do? And this role at Pro Athletes Outreach came along that, once again, on paper, it became the only obedient thing to do. I'm really grateful that we knew what the obedient thing to do was at that time, but I could have told you, I would have loved to have stayed in campus ministry. We loved that time and season of life. But Pro Athletes Outreach has been around since 1971, just over 50 years. And I've had the honor of serving as the president for the last 11 plus years. And just standing on the shoulders of giants who came before in the previous generations of pro athletes, because back in 71, it was a very different landscape ministry-wise than it is today. It was a very lonely place to be a pro athlete if you were also a Christ follower. Yeah. And there weren't chaplaincy programs everywhere. But today, PAO, we work with chaplains all over the place, primarily in pro hockey, pro baseball, and pro football. But we are open to and excited about any athlete who gets to that elite and pro level, spending time with them. And we exist for two reasons. One, to see men and women in the world of pro sports become disciples of Jesus and grow in their faith. And number two, walk with them to the extent that they want to make a positive impact in the world for his glory and not their own. So that's what we do. That's 365 days a year where I'm in my office right now, getting ready for, conferences that are coming up in the current cycle. And then for the time that we spend in between conferences trying to serve men and women in pro sports, either to introduce them to Jesus for the first time or help them grow in their walk with Jesus as they journey through the life of pro sports and beyond.
And obviously you're a former pro athlete, but you can attest to this, that athletes go through the same struggles that somebody like me goes through, or somebody else who has never played a professional sport or been on a huge stage like that. And that's why a ministry like PAO is so important, right? Because it helps equip them, it helps walk them through different journeys that they're all in, whether it's struggles with marriage or whether it's finances or whatever it is. I just think that the ministry, and I would assume you would agree with this, is so vital to uniquely help the place that these pro athletes are in, and former pro athletes too.
We all do things, every single one of us. We are human beings that do things, and not just, it's unique when a lot of people watch what you do and you're pretty recognizable. And that group becomes smaller the higher up you go in any realm. That's right. In terms of accomplishment. So when you get to the pro level, it's a pretty small, unique group. And we all are more open to change and growth when we're in a comfortable context amongst others who can relate to us. And so we all need that, no matter who it is that's listening to this or might ever listen to it. Being amongst peers is a sweet time, and it's a sweet thing. And so what we're able to do is create a peer-to-peer environment where just real life change, life growth can happen, and be honest in real conversations. We oftentimes say we try to create a locker room type environment. Mm-hmm. So, and to be honest, when you're done playing, like I still miss the locker room to this day. Yeah. The locker room was a sweet place as a pro, as an athlete, in high school, college, pros, whatever. It's just a fun time to be with your peers because you talk about real stuff and you talk from the same vantage point. And that's what happens at our conferences and in the things that we try to facilitate.
So as we wind down, PAO is the locker room, but we also get to do ministry together with Sports Spectrum, which is sort of the stadium side of the ministry that we get to work together in, where people get to hear and see these stories like yours right now. How's that been? It's been 5 years. Can you believe 5 years since, first of all, since Sports Spectrum came into the pro athletes outreach realm, but even almost 5 years since you and I started our dialogue, maybe even a little bit longer. And here we are doing this together, this interview. It's kind of crazy.
It is crazy. I love it. It's a great partnership with you, Jason. You're doing a great job. Grateful for all you've poured in over these years. But I'm with you. I think stadium's the right metaphor when we talk about Sports Spectrum. And we need platforms like Sports Spectrum where faith and sports come together, and there's no compromise of either. We love talking sport and we love talking faith. Right. And there's a way in which a large number of people relate in that regard. And it's so there's a conviction that sport crosses over into a variety of conversations and contexts where we get excited to see how can we keep growing and keep doing more and more and more of that, because it's a sweet opportunity to have that. And I know our pro community, when they gather together, they love having Sports Spectrum as a platform to tell stories and to let the world see what they care most about, and that's their faith in Christ.
Yeah, I mean, we've had pro athletes retire and announce their retirement through Sports Spectrum because they know that we're going to keep Christ in the conversation, and that's a beautiful thing. Last question as we wind down, last one. Again, happy birthday, right? Tomorrow's your birthday, 50th birthday. As you think about your 50th birthday, what are you most excited about in your 50th year? What are you thinking about? Where's God kind of bringing you, and what's he teaching you? What are you excited about here as you get ready for that big 5-0?
I appreciate that. There's a lot. I remember when I turned 40, and Trent Dilfer is one of my best friends in this world. And we sat together and we both said at that time, we used to have breakfast every Friday morning in the Bay Area together. When we hang out, we just talk for hours. And we said, when we turned 40, we said, I think we're entering the most important decade of our life. And I was just with Trent recently, and we both kind of joked, like, you think maybe in our 50s we could get a do-over for that? So,
yeah, right.
But no, it just feels like we're entering the most important decade of my life. And some of that has to do with the stage of life of parenting that we already talked about, the empty nest. I mean, I'm excited to keep pouring into my kids' lives and the season that they're in. And if the next generation comes along and I've got a grandkid here someday, that'd be amazing. Mm-hmm. But I think what I think about there, Jason, is I've got to keep growing in my own faith in Christ. And I want to stay kind of ahead of them on the wisdom continuum, if you will. Like, so keep parenting all the way through their lives. And that just changes and shifts over the course of time. So from a family standpoint, and for Lori and I in our marriage, and we've been married 26 and a half years, or almost 27 years. And it's like, what a sweet season to be entering into with her. And then personally, I'm just excited. People that know me know I've been talking about a book for a long time. And it's actually become a little bit of a joke that I may never get it out, but I am resolved to finally get a book published in my 50th year, here after my 50th birthday. And sometime in the coming year, the 330 Life will hit bookshelves or Amazon at least. And I hope it captures a couple things. I hope it captures my football journey somewhat, some of the stories that we've just talked about, and my faith journey and the things the Lord has taught me. Ultimately, just like Joe Montana was a guy I admired and looked up to, and when Bill Walsh came in to coach me, like, amazing. John the Baptist is a guy that I've always been in awe of in Scripture. And so much of what we do here at Pro Athletes Outreach is around what we call the increase. John 3:30, he must increase, but I must decrease. 7 simple words. I wonder what got John to that point where when he was asked that question in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John, how did he respond with such simple conviction and clarity that he must increase, but I must. I don't think John the Baptist is supposed to be a wax museum figure that we walk past. I think there's a lot of things from his life that we get to emulate in life when we discover the unique design that God has for us.
He is Steve Stenstrom. Long overdue, my friend, but happy 50th to you. Love you. Thank you for being a great leader and guide for me, and really changing my life in a lot of ways, giving me this opportunity with Sports Spectrum. But thanks for sharing your story as well. Here's to 50 more, 50 more years.
We'll see, Lord willing. We'll just take them one day at a time. But thank you, Jason. Yeah, grateful for all you do. And this is fun to be on with you.
And I'm super thankful for Steve Stenstrom, not only for coming on Sports Spectrum's podcast today, but just for being an amazing friend, amazing leader, really the man responsible in some ways. Obviously, God is responsible, but he's one of the few that are very responsible for me ever coming and working at Sports Spectrum. And I know I speak for my colleagues at Sports Spectrum in thanking Steve, because the work that we get to do is so special and so unique. Working in the media space, but telling stories about sports and Jesus. I mean, that's just not common. Go find other sports and faith content out there. It's hard to find. There's a couple people doing it, but it is hard to find. And Steve has entrusted us to do this, what we get to do every day at Sports Spectrum, bringing Jesus into the sports conversation. So I don't think he understands how grateful I truly am. And I'll always be thankful to him for giving me this opportunity. And I'm thankful for his friendship. And I'm thankful that he shared his story. He's got a really cool story, walking through some highs and some lows. And glad he shared it today on Sports Spectrum. Happy 50th, Steve. And I hope you have a great 50th year. Can't wait to join you on the journey and see where God takes us in 2022. We thank Steve, of course. We thank you for listening as well. Do us a favor, click that subscribe button on whatever app you're listening to this podcast on. Probably listening on Apple or Spotify, wherever you're listening. Click subscribe so you never miss an episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast. And then take a look at what Sports Spectrum's about on our website and understand that we're a resource, right? We want to be a resource for you, a resource for your friends. Maybe you can share the gospel of Jesus Christ with someone because of something you heard or read at Sports Spectrum. So consider that. Consider Sports Spectrum as a resource. You can check out sportsspectrum.com, read all of our free content, You can get our 52-week Increase devotional. You can get our Sports Spectrum magazine. Tons of resources available, and it's all there at sportspectrum.com. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time right here on the show. Have a great rest of your day. Please do stay safe.